I think we've all got to treat this as if it were a war that's about to break out. And if there were a war about to break out, then everyone would be marshalled. From the government down to parents to schools, everyone was pulling together. And I think if we could create, without sort of alarming people unduly, but if we could create a kind of mindset that this is a war, it's a war I hope we can win, but nonetheless that's the proportion that we face, that's the kind of dimension we're up against. If we could create that mindset, then maybe we can succeed.
I think it's a kind of intuitive idea that we discount the future. So things that are further ahead, we worry about less usually because they're further away. And one of the problems with climate change is that it is a distant issue in many different ways. So it's for most people in a country like the UK, it's not here, it's happening somewhere else physically. It's not now, it's far away in time as well. And it's also kind of psychologically distant as well, because we can't link our own actions and behaviours to climatic outcomes in any kind of meaningful way. We don't necessarily feel the threats that we know are there if we're told by scientists that serious climate impacts are coming in the future. At the same time, we look out the window and we can't see any evidence of that happening. So it's often said that climate change is almost kind of custom built to evade our psychological detection machinery, which works quite well for most things, but doesn't really seem to be up to the task of picking up on this really distant, abstract, intangible risk.
Temporal discounting means that people have the tendency to evaluate the future less than the now, the immediate. So people prefer immediate outcomes over future outcomes. So if you give somebody €100 now, it will be more value to people than if you give it in 90 days. So that is what's meant by temporal discounting. They discount the future. Well, there are some problems coming by the temporal discounting that humans have. For example, problems are that people go for the now, so the resources are depleted for the now without thinking of what future consequences will be. So that's a really big problem of this tendency of future discounting. So therefore it's important for policy to know that people have this tendency and to know how to influence it. Because if you can change this tendency or be aware of it, make people aware of it, maybe it can help them to make more long-term strategies and behavior and decisions.
Because a significant number of current environmental problems, and they range widely from water quality to ocean acidification to climate change, a wide range of current environmental problems are due to human behavior patterns. They have their roots, they find their origins in human behaviors, which in turn rest on basic beliefs, basic needs, attitudes, cultural habits, and institutional values that we live up to, like our desire for economic growth. And if we would be unable to change our behaviors and the factors that underlie our behaviors, our attitudes, even our needs, then these current huge environmental problems will continue to aggravate, and we will not be able to solve them in time.
Behavior is a very crucial factor influencing environmental problems, but also all kinds of solutions that are being now suggested to reduce environmental problems, they involve human behavior or at least acceptability. So if we want to install solar panels or windmills, people have to find them acceptable, because if everyone would resist it, it would not be feasible to implement this in democratic societies for sure. So acceptability is a key issue as well. So that's why you need to look at human behavior and to see how you can encourage people to accept all kinds of pro-environmental conduct or appliances or techniques, but also promote the use of these and encourage people to act more pro-environmentally.
Well, I think there's an evolutionary explanation for it. And I think that we were not, if you can use this term, designed, so to speak, for this present environment. We were designed for an environment very different from this one, where you didn't really have to take the future into consideration. For a start, there wasn't the threat coming from climate change. There may well have been threats from other tribes and so on, and various catastrophes, but nothing quite comparable to climate change, obviously. Life expectancy was much shorter, so the brain that evolved was one that was, in quote, designed to solve problems in the here and now. How do I get through the next 24 hours? How do I get enough food to survive for the next week? How do I find a shelter? How do I stop being attacked by another tribe? These were all relatively short-term considerations, and the brain was designed to react to them on a short-term basis. We now live in an environment that's changed beyond recognition, and the threat no longer comes from a mammoth, and in the Western world it doesn't come from famine, it doesn't come from, generally speaking, from physical dangers, not there to the same extent they once were, but the pressing physical threat now is the long-term uncertain one of climate change. And the thing that distinguishes us as humans from other species, our closest relatives, is particularly the cortex and a region at the front called the prefrontal cortex. That is at its most enlarged and most sophisticated in humans, which gives us these extraordinary capacities for time travel, to imagine futures that are not ever likely to happen, to go back hundreds, thousands of years in time travel and so on. And that should be potentially a very powerful tool that we have as part of our brain anatomy for solving these problems. Unfortunately, the prefrontal cortex, which is that which calls upon memories, it's involved in holding memories online, holding anticipated futures online, etc. That part of the brain can be overwhelmed by the lower parts of the brain, which we do share with other species. And this is what happens when we go for the short-term option. The long-term memories, thoughts, predictions, and so on, mediated by the prefrontal part of the brain, can be relatively impotent in the face of powerful signals from the subcortical, the lower parts of the brain shared with other species. That's the biological rooting of A, our capacities, and B, the failure of those capacities to solve our problems.
I guess like most people, I'm not a climate scientist, and so I have to rely on the evidence of scientists to tell me about what's happening with the climate, because I can't detect that evidence for myself. We just had the latest intergovernmental panel on climate change assessment report. These things come out every 7 years, thousands of scientists, thousands of papers, and this was the 5th assessment report that they've issued. The message is not that different to the one that they issued 25 years ago, but it's more and more urgent each time. It's unequivocal. Humans are affecting the climate through the carbon emissions from our energy use, from our industry, from our travel, and this has got a range of serious consequences for human systems, for food supplies, water scarcity, things like flooding. and for natural systems as well. So I guess when I'm talking to members of the public, I don't ever present myself as an expert on the science. I would defer to some group like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I think it's clear that there is a consensus, an overwhelming consensus amongst scientists. And when people understand that there is a consensus, they're more likely to agree that action should be taken. And typically you find that there's a gap between what most people think is the level of agreement between scientists and the actual level of agreement. But I guess this is where the psychology comes into it. It's not necessarily the easiest job in the world to convince people that there is a consensus in the first place. So all these ideas of, the uncertainty of climate change being greater than it really is, perhaps campaigns that have tried to exaggerate that uncertainty, are all in the mix. And then the difficulty is in finding sort of messages and messengers that can talk about climate change in a way that people have a lot of trust in. It's not really the uncertainty itself. It's because they don't like the idea of the solutions that are on the table, or they feel like they clash with their values or their ideology in some way. So the uncertainty, the focus on the uncertainty, is a kind of a symptom of the underlying issue, which is that for example, for a conservative or someone that's more right-leaning in their ideology, they don't want to see the regulation of industry because that clangs up against their ideology. They don't want to see taxation go up, and these are things that have become so deeply associated with climate change that people work backwards from the fact they don't like the proposed solutions to question the underlying science. So I think if there were a much greater range of alternative policy proposals on the table that had kind of engagement and buy-in from a much broader range of people from across the political spectrum, then when you like the answer to climate change more, you don't make so much of a fuss about interrogating the questions underneath it. And I think that's where a lot of the obsession with communicating uncertainty comes from.
You need a future prospect. People need to know where we are going with society, and I myself with my personal life. If you are the authority and you tell me that I should change my behavior, and if we all change our behaviors, then the environment will live forever in high qualities, then you still haven't answered my question, but where does my life go? Where will I end? Where will I be about in 10 years or 20 years' time? So we also need an image of our own future, and it should be attractive and promising enough and secure enough for me to go along with the behavior changes you are requesting.
People don't respond well to sort of doom and gloom messages about catastrophe unless they really feel that catastrophe themselves. So, if they can see their house on fire or something, there's a very direct link, or even the link between something like smoking and lung cancer. It's your lungs, it's your body. That threat is real, it's direct, it's personal. You can do something about it. Although addiction is kind of complex, you can in theory do something about it. With something like climate change, we can be told that the risks of climate change are catastrophic, and in many ways they could be if things don't change soon. But we don't feel it, and if we don't feel it, we're just going to respond by switching off, turning away, denying that there's a problem in the first place. So the kind of counter to that is to then say, well, let's use positive messages instead. And I would endorse that, but only one meaning of the word positive. I think people have tried to come up with messages about climate change that are positive, as in everything's going to be great, everything's going to be fine. I think that's not only misleading, but also people can kind of see through it. On the one hand, they're being told this is the most serious problem in the world. On the other hand, everything's going to be fine. Those two things clash. But I think messages should be positive in the sense they should be constructive. So they shouldn't just describe a problem, they should set out or involve people in a conversation about what could you do to resolve that problem. And that, in that sense, positive messages are important because they're constructive. But I think positive messages that just try and put everything into a positive light and downplay the disadvantages, I think are just in the long term a bit of a false economy.
The crucial point is immediacy. That it is no use a benefit that is appreciated in months or years. I say it's no use. Under some conditions it's not much use. Let's be more precise about it. Because after all, people do invest in the future. People go to university and study for 3, 4, 6, 7 or 8 years. That's a long-term investment. Why are they doing that? So there is the capacity, but nonetheless, a lot of these systems can be overwhelmed by short-term considerations.
There's quite a long history now of research in social sciences which has looked at the reasons why people do or don't engage positively with different areas of science. So way before climate change was an issue, there's been controversies over things like GM crops. And for a long time it was assumed that people would be more likely to support GM crops, GM food, if they understood more about the science. So that was kind of referred to as the deficit model of public engagement, because it was assumed people had a lack of knowledge, a deficit of knowledge, and if we could fill that knowledge with science, they'd get on board with whatever it was the kind of scientific message was. Now that's been shown to be really not true at all. And so it's things like people's political ideology, the values that they hold, their worldviews. These are the kind of things that shape their attitudes about specific areas of science, including climate change. So although climate change, it appears on the surface to be a problem of getting the science out to the people, actually there's psychology involved at every step of the way, I think. And I think even in terms of the policies that you think of when you think of the big changes that will happen in response to climate change that will really make a big difference. Maybe it's investment in a solar array or something like that in the Sahara that could power southern Europe, or legislation that would create a binding agreement for all the countries across the world. And you think, well, maybe psychology doesn't have all that much to do with those things, but it's people in the boardrooms making the decisions to invest. It's people in the negotiation rooms, deciding what those policies will be. So whether a new big technological development happens, whether a new policy comes into play, it's all still dependent on the people that are making those decisions, whether the public accepts new wind turbines, things like that. So, all of those decisions are made by humans, the same as you or I, and who are vulnerable to the same sort of biases of reasoning as you or I. So to my mind at least, psychology is at the very, very heart of it.
I do agree. I think you should start early with changing values, and there are some programs nowadays that try to come up with activities to engage children at a young age in environmental friendly practices, to make them develop their own type of interventions and strategies. But it's not being systematically studied, but I do think it would be very important.
I think it's very difficult, but we've somehow got to get the message through. We've got to use techniques of reinforcement so that people are reinforced for socially desirable, sustainable activities rather than unsustainable activities. And I'm afraid politicians tend to organise societies so that the unsustainable activities are almost automatically reinforced, whereas those that are sustainable tend to fall by the wayside, or they don't get political attention.
This entire business of economic growth is manifesting itself in different sectors. Fishing, recreation, travel, food production, in a way that shows that people don't believe the world is finite, in a way that shows that people think that we can keep growing all the time, that we can keep expanding our everyday behavior patterns, filling our days with ever more efficiently organized behaviors, so that we have nice experiences, nice things to consume and nice things to undertake, nice people to meet, but the entire package of environmental impacts that brings those things bring along with them, people don't realize them, and they're not aware of them, and or if they are aware of them, they cannot withdraw from them. They cannot free themselves from these environmental impacts, because what else should they do? They can't live. They're not living on an island. They want to belong to society, and society is moving in a particular direction, and so again here a sociologist should come forward and say, I know how to start social movements that gradually may help moving society in another direction.
Although I'm not an expert in business and consumption patterns, it does seem to be a pretty stark contradiction between continual economic growth and sustainability on a finite planet. And again, that's one of those conversations that doesn't really percolate very far outside of specialist groups, but it seems very bound up with every conversation about climate change. Resources and climate change go together.
I think one of the problems is that governments, well, in this country are elected every 5 years. Presidents in the United States are elected every 4 years. And inevitably, they're going to have their eye on the next election. And I feel that that fact is giving a tendency to short-termism, because 4 years, well, we'll now be 1 year away, the election. The temptation must be enormous to give people short-term rewards.
It's a systems problem. It's a structural problem, mostly. So I believe in the effectiveness of structural changes rather than individual changes, because people have limited degrees of freedom for changing their behavior.
People literally don't talk about it. It's a scientific reality, it's not a social reality. It's not there. It's not there in people's peer groups, it's not there in the kind of considerations that you just have day to day, in the same way that, I don't know, in some ways health and safety legislation and regulation, as much as it has a bad name in some ways, people have just kind of accepted that it's there, it's part of the day-to-day fabric of life. There's certain things that you have to do. So it needs, and I think climate change needs to exist on that almost mundane level as well as at the same time simultaneously sort of inspiring people to have conversations and to think and to dream and to hope about what they want the future to be like. But there's never really been that focused effort to sit people down in different social groups, and use different cultural representatives to initiate conversations about climate change. What does climate change mean to you as someone from the tourism industry, as someone with a Christian background, as someone who is interested in music? Every single person from every walk of life, no matter what you're interested in, has something that they care about and that they love that is going to be impacted by climate change. And if you can start from those things and work up from there, I think that would be a kind of revolution in how people think about climate change. Climate change needs to be in soap operas. It needs to be in radio documentaries. Not as in, here's a documentary about climate change, but as in, here's a documentary about anything, but it has an element of climate change in, because climate change affects everything. So it's like, at the moment it's not visible yet in the kind of fabric of social reality, even though we've been telling each other for years it's the most important challenge we face in the 21st century. You wouldn't know that from looking at the arts and from literature and from anything really outside of kind of science and policy. It just doesn't exist there yet in the level it should.
Emotion is crucial here. Empathy is crucial here. I think we need in school to teach children to be empathetic towards their fellow humans. And I mean, when I used to talk about this a year or 2 years back, I'd always give an example like Bangladesh or the Philippines or somewhere. Now these examples are clearly equally relevant today, but as we speak there are people suffering from climate change in this country, just a few hundred miles from where we're making this program. And I think the more children are brought up in school to be taught empathy, it's there. I mean, the capacity for empathy is within every human brain, as is the capacity for evil, I guess, within every human brain. It depends upon the environment that that child is put into. And if that child is given lessons, is shown, experiences something of the suffering of people that is brought about by climate change, then I would hope that their decision making would later reflect that learning experience?
I think there are two main strategies. On the one hand, and that are closely interlinked. So it's not that you do either the one or the other. So first you have to make sure that people care about the environment and are willing to act accordingly. And that's also what we find, that people with strong biospheric values who care about the environment as such, they are more likely to engage in pro-environmental actions. So that's one strategy, and that's particularly important because in many cases pro-environmental actions cost you a little bit more. It might be money-wise, might be comfort, might be effort. So in order to overcome these barriers, it's important that you're strongly motivated to do something. So that's the first thing. But on the other hand, you also have to facilitate that action. So you have to make sure that people are able to engage in pro-environmental actions and that they're not too costly. Because if it's very costly, even those who are very keen on promoting environmental quality might not do it, because there's a too strong conflict between their values. So on the one hand, you have to make sure that you facilitate that behavior, that you remove important barriers for people to engage in sustainable actions, and you have to make sure that they care about the environment.
We brought people to a nature environment, which was the Amsterdam forest, and to an urban environment, which was Amsterdam Zuid. It's an urban environment with very new buildings, so aesthetically it's quite beautiful, so to say. So there's not a big difference of valence. At least we try to minimize this valence difference between natural environment, which is of course more beautiful than an urban environment. And what we let the participants do is to walk around in the environment for 5 minutes, and also having this imaginary script read by them, like imagine how it is, wonder how listen to the sounds in the environment, look what you see. So they were really paying attention to the environment. So what happened in the nature environment is that people evaluated the future more. And that is, I think, really important for what we want with regard to environmental causes and consequences. We want to make people value the future more, to make sure that they make more long-term strategies and decisions. And I think nature can enhance this, and that's a great finding. Our results gives one solution. There are maybe more, but one big solution for policymakers to make people act more with a future-oriented mind. Namely, that if you enhance the nature surrounded by the people, for example, you bring more nature to the schools, you bring more nature in the streets, you bring more nature in working place, and let people be more in touch with nature. Yeah, that is a solution to make them act more future-oriented. So that's really, I think, a tool that policies must be aware of. Also for themselves. If they want to make long-term decisions, go, bring yourself to nature, discuss in a more natural environment, and you will see that you make more long-term decisions. So that's one, I think, interesting finding of our study. And hopefully there will be more research that look at other effects on how to influence people their temporal discounting, because there might be more. But this is one that has a strong effect on people their long-term decision making.
Like, you know, one of those things like the Olympics in 2012?
Yes.
The national feeling behind the Olympics. It wasn't the fact that people aren't really interested in something running 100 metres. Not really. Not in their days. They're not thinking about it now. They're not thinking about Usain Bolt now. The mega positive feeling around the country.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to talk about that. I thought that was quite an interesting thought I just had.
Yes, I mean, an interesting aspect of this is when we do come together collectively, as in the Olympic Games, for example, there is this sort of feeling of bonding, of pride, etc., in some national achievement. Now, how we can exploit that to our ends in terms of a better world, I don't know, but I think it's worth investigating.